Right, good morning. Thank you for giving up some time. I know it's the busiest time of year, in the financial year. My name's Simon Donovan. I'm from CRI and Fuse Fleet, and we're going to be talking about the future of fleet safety today, not just policies and tick boxes, but people, culture, and proactive strategies. So as brokers, let's talk away from what's the claims history to more about talking about the people and the employees so that we can focus on things like stress, fatigue, which are signs way before the claims come in. And we're going to move from compliance to commitment, from reactive to proactive. And we're going to hear from two, I'm going to use this word the way I mean it, legends in the industry. So Jerome and Tammy, good morning.
Morning, Simon. Legend, that's a big call.
Sorry, experts in the industry.
Morning, Simon. Simon. I feel like I'm an elite company, actually.
Jerome, you're in Queensland today on business trip. Tammy, you're in wet Perth, I understand, and we're in Sydney, freezing cold today. So it's we're all over the country.
You should try being from Melbourne. That's freezing cold.
So Jerome, as the Director of National Road Safety Partnership Program, and having spent the last decade working in this industry, and you're all about road safety, what do you think is the number one priority in terms of fleet safety? How do you approach fleet safety?
That's a great question. I guess, how do I approach it? I'll just get us up to the right slide. There we go. That's a really good question. I know how I approach it. I guess I've been approached by many organizations, and it's quite fascinating is you'll have a lot of them will sit there and go to me, what's the silver bullet? And the first thing I'll say is there's no silver bullet. There is no one single thing that can keep your fleet safe. So we always talk about it's very much sort of a systems-based approach. And I guess the big thing is you really need a lot of clarity in understanding that, like thinking about who's in your driving community, what their roles are, who's responsible for what, being accountable, and really how you can sort of build and bring your workers across. Because one thing that gets overlooked all the time is driving for work is the most dangerous work-related activity, and the data's clear for that. It's around 50% year on year. It used to be up to 2/3, so it's pulled back, but it's the number one risk to workers out on the road. And the complex thing for organisation, for people who drive every day, is 85% of them think they're awesome, and which is statistically impossible. But everyone thinks they're a fantastic driver, and there's all these reasons as to why they're doing it. But the other part is a lot of organisations forget about people out on the road, and they focus on what they think are the most dangerous things, which is the factory floor, those things, because it's out of sight, out of mind. And a lot of organisations get very complacent as a result of that, as to what they think is the key sort of risk in that sort of sense. So, sorry about that.
That's all right.
So yes, I'm going through and just thinking about all this stuff. People get very complacent. There's lots of demands on the workers. And I think the big thing at the moment that we're sort of thinking about is what are the number one risk is complacency is sitting out there at the moment. So I think you really need to think about, well, workers are being stretched, they're getting pushed so hard at the moment. Management, C-SPAN, all them start getting quite complacent. Drivers get complacent. Driving for work is out of sight, out of mind. And as a result, the culture sort of driving into and just sort of forgetting about the workers as they're out and about.
Okay. So Tambia, you've worked with some of the biggest fleets in the country, and I think you've just won, well, I know you won Fleet Safety Manager of the Year award 2 years in a row with two separate organizations. So you've come in as a consultant. So congratulations. And again,
Thanks,
I think we can call you an expert on that front. So from a behavior perspective, because you look at things like data and behavior in your business, what do you see as some of the early red flags in driver behavior that we can talk about?
Thanks, Simon. So yeah, I think what I'd like to start with is what we work with data, like you said, but I think the two key things with improving driver safety, I think it always starts with culture, with the safety culture. If that is, if that's not present, or if the safety culture is not right, all the technology that we work with. So we are primarily in the space of technology like telematics and dash cams and all the data that brings and what that tells you. But data can only give you actionable insights and things to action on if the safety culture is right. So the two organizations that you mentioned last 2 years that have won the safety award, what they had in place is the right leadership, right safety culture, which then allows us to use the data analysis to get actionable insights on what the early signs might be. Which drivers have a behavioral problem, possibly, which drivers are doing things out of habit, and then there could be other drivers who might have other issues, like you mentioned, early warning signs like stress. We talk about presenteeism that drivers might be experiencing for various reasons. They're there, but they're not there. It's a really, it's an interesting word. And like Jerome said, it's highly dangerous activity. It's the most dangerous activity that any worker really does. I've worked in the electricity industry, for example, and even there, driving is the highest risk activity. So it has to start with culture, and then the data can give you a lot of actionable insights. I've actually got a question for Jerome, just on the 85% that he mentioned. It's really interesting because I think what we see with drivers is behavioral problems versus drivers who, most drivers think that they're better than average, which is that stat. But would you say, Jerome, that most drivers actually want to do the right thing?
I think when you begin understanding that 85% angle, I think one of the key things, and I always do this when I do a presentation or engage in organizations' workers, I sit there and go, I'll ask everyone, and I'll ask everyone in the audience, who here is a good driver? And look, I'll put my hand up and say, look, I'm a great driver. I'll then ask, who here is a bad driver? And I'll put my hand up again. And a lot of people are quite flummoxed going, because I never said you're going to vote once. But the thing is everyone needs to understand everyone has good and bad days. And I think this goes back to the culture. Every organization has a culture, and you want to move towards a continuous improvement sort of culture where you're drawing on data insights, but it takes a long time before you can you can go to a mature thing of having telematics data because all those stuff flowing in there. But a really mature continuous improvement culture is people begin to understand when they're having a bad day, and people begin reflecting on themselves, and they're empowered. Like we did a campaign a while ago when we said, are you roadworthy? And it's getting people to think about in your own headspace what's going on, because when you get in the vehicle, you don't leave everything outside and you get in the vehicle. Next to me, I'm just in driving mode. I'm focusing just on the task. You got all these other pressures, and I think this is the hard part people and workers need to understand is you're thinking about the next step, you're thinking about these, and that's why driving sits up there as amongst the top risks, because people naturally are trying to plan, they're trying to squeeze more and more in. And the question is, there's only so much you can squeeze into every sort of trip, and then you have a bit of congestion, you have other things. And the question I love sort of throwing to organizations as a step is, if someone's driving 10, 12, 15, 18 hours a week, do you have that as a KPI? Is that built into your job description? If so, and then how are you going to measure? And the basic fundamentals to start with might be you're looking at their demerits, the driving history, the condition of the vehicle, things like that. And then you say, well, now we're going to begin coaching and growing and putting things in. We'll improve our data management. We'll start bringing in other items, technology, telematics, things like this. And you begin building that in systematically as you begin enhancing the culture and you go down the coaching process.
So Jerome, on that, what would be the first thing? What's the first bit of advice? Because you unpacked so much there, and you're coming into a fresh fleet. What's the first thing, or what's the most common gap you see? And this is to both of you that you can address. Almost, what's the quick wins the brokers can talk to their clients about?
From my point of view, I can talk about probably ignoring what the data is telling you. What we talk about all the things that need to be in place, safety, leadership, but once that is in place, or the data is being collected, for me, I think the biggest or one of the biggest risks is that you have a lot of technologies in place and the data is being collected, but nobody is doing anything with it. And we hear about it a lot and we see it a lot. And if I was to put a number on it, in my experience, I would say probably 80 to 90% of fleets that I have worked with or heard about that are collecting data, they're underutilizing it.
Right.
So they're not they're not analyzing. They're just really missing a great opportunity to get actionable insights from the data. So that's the.
Tell me, on the data front, data comes in many different shapes and disguises. When you talk about data, what specifically, or what types of data, because it's the new gold, is coming out of fleets that's been ignored? So any sort of specific examples?
Telematics is probably for those who don't know what telematics is, it's like a little black box that gets installed inside a vehicle, has an accelerometer, has a GPS chip, and it measures all your movements. So basically, it measures how fast you're traveling, how aggressively you're driving, which is harsh driving metrics such as acceleration, braking, cornering. So that kind of data really can tell you a lot about how drivers are driving. And if we go back to early warning signs, you might have a really, really good driver, and the change in pattern might tell you that there's something wrong. They might have some family stress, or they might have something else going on that really changes their behavior, or in a short period of time where you have seen prolonged, they've been really good drivers.
Yeah.
And actually, and just drawing on that point with Tangwei, like we did a webinar ages ago with one of Australia's major transport companies, and he made a remark. They said there was this driver they had there. You could run he works on line haul, 220,000 Ks per annum, and you could run a clock off him. He was that good. Planned his journeys, everything. He was like the top of the top. And all of a sudden he rolls, like 20 years, all of a sudden rolls and writes off a B double. But the thing is when they went back and they looked at the data, because they basically had the same thresholds for everyone in the organization. They just one size fits all approach. But then when you have these ones like who are the best in that sort of level, they look back and they suddenly saw 6 weeks prior, for the first time, they started getting little blips, but it was never enough to go across the threshold because they had a one size fits all. And then all of a sudden they roll a truck and they went, "What happened 6 weeks ago?" And he goes, "Oh, I took possession of a new house." So all of a sudden, when he was his home, the downtime was working on the home. So he was no longer having the rest, the brakes, all those sort of components. And this is where the one size fits all. And the crucial thing is we have eyes on people. And back to your earlier point, Simon, I think if you want to sit there and go, what are some of the easy low-hanging fruits? I'd say the big thing is engage your workers. Have a conversation with them, get them to give you the feedback. What's the burning issue sitting in? Because sometimes management's assuming. And we did a great webinar with Osmos a few weeks ago now, Tang, we was part of, and I think that was a real powerful message that came through in there. Your workers are out there. What's driving them? What's pushing them? What's sitting on their minds? Are the KPIs in the organisation creating the right behaviour, driving the right sort of elements? Yeah. And is the organisation enabling that? Because I was talking to one organisation just last week, and they just said our KPIs give no room for wriggle room, and so they're always behind. They're always trying to play catch up. And do you understand what that's doing to your workers when they're out on the road? Like,
which is why drone couriers in the insurance industry are so hard to insure. They're almost uninsurable these days because of the time factors, the stress on those drivers. So yeah, it's a real problem. Go on.
And there's part of that culture, engaging drivers early, that also really helps with any implementation of technology, which goes a long way towards using the tech to help drivers. And when you bring them along the journey, you gain their trust, and they stop seeing it as Big Brother, because that's the goal, to use the technology for everyone's benefit, where drivers actually start asking for more data. They want to see what they're doing. And that can only happen when there's transparency, when there's early engagement, where communication is clear. Otherwise, I have worked with organizations
Yeah.
where there's a strict policy of discipline, loses drivers really early. You
Yeah.
lose their trust, and then they start seeing it. Everyone gets quite threatened by everything, and it's not about it. It becomes more about compliance then.
The big brother aspect, isn't it? Is that,
Yeah.
everyone's worried about privacy, and that's the point, Tanvir. I was thinking about driver policies, and we don't see a lot of companies with driver policies in place. I don't know if there's any learnings, or Jerome, you've seen anything. I know there's some pretty standardized now. You can just Google and it will create a driver policy for you. But as underwriters at Fuse and Current Insurance, we see fleets, a couple hundred vehicle size fleets with almost no driver policy in place. Is it something that you guys are aware of, or certainly from a Monash point of view, Jerome, is it something you guys see as an opportunity for SMEs and enterprise fleets?
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to be releasing stuff come October, which will be helping some of those components. We're just signing an agreement with National Highways and bringing the policy generator from the UK, and we'll adapt it to Australia. We actually have a grey fleet project at the moment, and with a big working group, we're testing it with 4 different organisations, and there's about 20 in the working group around the outside. For those of you who sit there, so grey fleet is when you use vehicles that are not owned by the organisation for work-related purposes. And for some people, it can freak them out a little bit when you discover you've got the same duty of care for workers in those vehicles as you do for vehicles that you own. One of the organisations we're testing it with has 7,500 grey fleet, so put that in perspective.
Wow.
But what we're creating in this is it'll be a policy generator that will come through. It's got the aim being is everyone's at different stages of the development. There'll be all these different measures, and you work out where you're sitting, and it will then spit out guidance. So, because generating a policy can take a while in large organisations, small SMEs, awesome. You can do it, you can have, but it's still the same consultative sort of process, working with those and just getting them to understand how do you actually, I guess, engage your workers out in the road if you have no rules or guidance, or this is our expectation for you. And if you haven't got that sort of mapped out, well, you have no real sort of accountability about everything else in organisations. They'll have those sort of rules very clearly in place. And that's what it is. This is our expectation of when you drive for work, of how you represent our organisation, how you'll behave. And this is also our contract as to what we need to do, because it's got to be 2 ways. And I think it can't just be around management blaming everything on the driver. You're setting this. They're working for you. They're out on journeys. They're doing all these trips. It's 2 ways. And I think some organisations forget about that.
So from a broker point of view, do you think it's something we should be asking for? Brokers, they get a slip through, they want to understand the risk. Do you think it's a fact-finding question that would benefit brokers? Because it would definitely benefit underwriters from our side. But Tammy, do you think that's the kind of question that brokers might be able to build into their question set as they're talking about the motor risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually was going to ask you a question about, how or what kind of conversations brokers have. But, absolutely, I think when it comes to policy, how drivers are engaged, and just trying to find out a little bit of the why rather than just the what. I think normally the claims tells you, claims history tells you the what, and how many and what's happened. But I think what's missed is the underlying why, and if the organizations have that information, whether they're engaging with drivers, whether they're asking questions, like Jerome said before, just trying to understand why certain behaviors are changing.
We see multiple drivers, sometimes 5, 6 times the same driver having multiple accidents, and we don't necessarily see it's flagged by the broker. And then you sort of go back with the questions as to, talk to me about the risk management on that one driver. Almost should they have a vehicle? But it's a good point. Jerome, any comment on that?
Well, and I think, and that's a key thing. Like I remember on those drivers, it's like if you haven't got, I guess, your policy in place, how do you actually have accountability for that lone driver and saying this is the expectation for them? And I know one organisation I remember speaking with ages ago, they had a very clear consequence framework. They mapped it all out and they said, so you hit this level of your scores, this is what happens. And there's one guy, I think he got a warning on the second one. Next time is dismissal. And he left the organisation and he was ropeful, picked up his wife and kids from school, gets home, and his wife gets out of the car and goes, just to be very clear to you, everyone else is an effing idiot on the road. You're the constant everywhere. Us and the kids are not going in the car until you sort your crap out. He then went in, and because part of the requirement was you have to do mandatory training, and there'll be other sort of measures that go through that, telematics, all sort of stuff in there. So he went back in. He then sat and went through the training in the 2.5 days with open ears. And then 18 months later, he got most improved worker. And he shared the story with the GM when he got the award, and he goes, 18 months ago, you were about to sack me because of this, this, this. I went through, did this, and I considered, and I went, you're right. I don't have to be the first off the stoplights. I don't have to be in a rush getting everywhere. This isn't, as long as I get from A to B in a nice, safe way. And he goes, and what we sort of talk about, and the research is very clear on this, is how you drive is how you work, which is how you live. And they're all sort of integrated together. And what you want is you want to have a flourishing human. And what that means is they're engaged, they have meaning, and they have pleasure in life. So you want all three of them sort of working together, and that's going to create, and the correlation is the life satisfaction goes up, and it also means your penalties and breaches will actually go down massively. Because you think about it, if you're sitting there driving a vehicle and you're in a good sort of place and you're thinking about it, you're going to be far more productive. There, last point I'll say, everyone, is young males are the highest risk drivers on the road, correct? Everyone knows that. So you think about those three measures I mentioned, what's out of whack in their brain? Pleasure. So young males are looking for pleasure, and the car is a great outlet for that, but also lots of other things in life. And that's why there's that risk-taking behavior when they're in that younger sort of stage as well.
It reminds me, Jerome, of some of the research that your colleagues have done about mindfulness and how that improves driving. For me, it's sometimes I think, mindfulness might sound like a,
Fluff word?
hippie kind of word. Yeah, like a, fluffy word. But I mean, I can speak from my experience as well that, I have tried mindfulness for a number of years, and it just makes you a better driver. I think because it improves the way you live as well. I think it just ends up making you a better driver, just more patient. If you're running late to somewhere, it makes you less aggressive. It just goes such a long way, and that was such an interesting research for me to read.
And I think you're exactly right. I remember when we were doing one project, another guy, he called me up on the Monday after we had a meeting around this mindfulness piece. It was C-SPAN. He said he had a really, really bad Friday. And he got in his car and he actually did a broggy. He burnt out and he says, geez, that felt good. And then he sat there and went, He reflected on a conversation we had the day before, pulled back in, and he just sat there and goes, I just breathed, relaxed. And then he went, it's Friday, my crap week's finished. I've got an awesome weekend ahead.
Yeah.
I'm doing this, I've got this planned. And he said all of a sudden his whole demeanor and his sense changed. And he said, I then reversed out how I should have reversed out. And I drove home in a whole different headspace because you just changed gear. And I think a lot of people just don't understand if you can just pull yourself back and go, look, focus on the task, be in the moment, take some deep breaths, park the negativity, because driving is a ripper for being negative if you want, because you can just, you think about it, there's nothing like revving and putting things into the vehicle when you're out there.
We've seen the stats on that. Friday lunchtimes is one of the highest risks outside of commuter times. And we assume that's people clocking off the afternoon on their way home. Exactly what you said, Jerome. We generally see the riskiest time still at the commuter time from our data. But that's pretty logical. Or if you are employees dropping your kids off or picking them up in the morning, that is always when we've got the highest risk coming through. I've got a question actually from Alan O'Brien. Jerome, it's for you. Will the policy generator be free, and how/where will organizations be able to access it? So that's back to the driver policy.
Yep, it'll be free for everyone. And we're about to go through a big overhaul with our website, and we're adding in a new partner tier, and there's two parts for it as well. So one part, yes, the policy generator will be free for everyone. You can then sign on and you can become a partner of the program when this goes up. Because the other part we're going to bring in is organisations will be able to choose measures. So like Tanwi's been talking about the power of data and this sort of component, is organisations will be able to choose as part of the partnership which measures relate to their businesses. Because you'd be surprised at how many businesses just do not recognise driving as a risk or even capture it. And I'll just quickly share a story on this. Is where this idea came from is we'll develop innovation group. Paul Elliott used to sit on our steering committee, and we were talking after one of our meetings, and he sat there and he goes, "No, Jerome, I had a meeting the other day with this ASX top 50 company, and I was sitting outside waiting to go in. And I'm looking up at the board, and there's this thing that says 228 days since an incident." He went, "Hmm." He then walked on in, sat down with the C-SPAN, and he looked at them all around the room. He goes, "Congratulations on your 228 days without incident." They all started high-fiving each other and all sort of stuff. And he looked at me and goes, "I guess you're wondering why I'm here." And they all looked at each other, and the CEO said, "Yes, what makes you so important to be coming into our meeting?" And then Paul went, "Well, 22 days ago, one of your drivers was involved in a major incident on the road and was seriously injured. I'm here to talk about that. But you're saying you haven't had an injury." And all of a sudden, I think the colour drains and the COO ran out, pulled the sign down, and then the CFO went to the CEO. He went, "Our annual report's just gone out saying that." So they had to recall the annual report. And then what they shared is they don't collect any data on the vehicles. The vehicle's out of sight, out of mind. And that's when they realized, because this thing is, unless you're measuring it and collecting it, you don't know what's going on. And if you haven't got the right measures in place, so the new tool we're going to develop will help organizations have that framework of those sort of core measures. And then if we get a critical mass, you can see how you compare against other ones as well. So that'll be all launched in October as part of Safe Work Month.
The data point, we know that general fleets outside of heavy, only about, I don't know, 80%, sorry, 10 to 15% actually use data. So back to Tanvir's point, telematics. So that is a bit of an obstacle at the moment. But Tanvir, you're the data specialist and you analyze a lot of big data from telematics. So any advice for everyone on the call and brokers? Because this does come up in conversation. And generally the response is, we've looked at it, it's too expensive, we don't want to breach privacy, et cetera, et cetera. But you've obviously seen the benefits, particularly to Osmos and other fleets that you've worked on. So you're bought into the outcome, but there is a cost. And from what I understand, the whole change management process. So any sort of high level advice that we can give to brokers so that they can have those more meaningful chats?
Yeah, for me, I think one of the biggest things is to use it as a carrot rather than a stick. So using it for driver reward recognition, for coaching to improve drivers rather than discipline. If we talk about Osmos as an example, it was great. One of the reasons why they won the safety award was all the drivers were the driver buy-in was very high, because the data was being used to coach them to understand what's happening, and then to reward and recognize. Geron talked about the driver who got the most improved reward. So it's things like that. I think when they're in place, it also helps with gamification and competition amongst drivers as well. I truly believe that most drivers want to be good drivers. They want to improve, and when they see these kinds of policies in place, that it's therefore the drivers are being rewarded, not only the best drivers but most improved drivers as well. I think that just goes such a long way, rather than if it's a discipline tool, like I said before, I think you lose drivers pretty quickly.
Yeah, positive rather than like a parenting hack there, Tanvir, who's just recently had twins. So you're still awake? You're okay? Yeah.
And I think just pulling that through a little more as well, like if you just focus on, I guess, big reportable loss injuries, serious instances, claims, those sort of things, that's where you begin going, and you might think your culture's fantastic, and all of a sudden you have a major one, and you go, "Why is this blowing up?" I think that's where you need to work with the workers and the drivers out there and saying, well, all these little things matter as well.
Yeah.
Because your risk exposure is a lot higher. So all these little instances, and even if you think from a risk-based approach, I grew up in the country in regional WA. So for me, country driving was very natural. But if you just grow up in a city and suddenly you head out there, I guess your risk appetite, understanding what you're exposed to can be quite different. And the organisation might just have a one-size-fits-all approach to that understanding as well.
Yeah, disproportionately high number of claims in remote areas on our analysis as opposed to city. You talk about culture. How do you think gentlemen leadership play a part in developing that safety culture? Because I've seen firsthand it fail, but I've also seen firsthand where we've worked with organizations where it really has been bought in by the CEO, the owners, all the way down through. So how do you feel that leadership play that active role? Tam, it may be a question for yourself, buddy.
Sure. Well, I think it's probably the biggest factor. In my world, working with technology and data, it becomes ineffective very quickly if that's not there. And we talk about moving from a reactive to proactive culture. That can only happen if if it's top down, if it's driven from the top leadership. There's an interesting methodology that Osmos had actually shared in our webinar recently with an RSPP and Jerome. Bradley curve. What Bradley curve talks about is moving from a reactive culture where drivers are told what to do, all the way to the right side of the curve. It's a very interesting curve if someone wants to, if brokers want to look it up. It's sort of try slowly, you move the culture, or the leadership tries to move the culture to a point where drivers take responsibility for their own safety and also other drivers' safety. So they're asking questions, they're being proactive, they want to see more data. And that can only happen if the culture is transparent, if the culture is of trust, and drivers don't feel threatened that they're going to be sacked for driving poorly. They feel that it's for their own benefit and for their coaching.
Yeah.
And I'd even say, like with leadership, Simon, if you're going to introduce policy, telematics, technology like this, one of the most powerful things you could do is have the leadership be the first ones to sign up and go, we'll do it, and we'll public report, and we'll have it in our vehicles. We'll lead by example. Because I think there's nothing worse when you go, we'll put it all on this sort of population, and we're above it all. Because I think you need to have them leading by example and part of it all.
Yeah, 100%. We have an example of a client who's now running closer to sort of 25-30% loss ratio, and they were uninsurable 3 years ago, and that's predominantly down to the EGM there, who lives and breathes safety culture. And he's changed that risk from, unbelievably, but he lives and breathes it. And it makes such a difference. Tanvir, we got a couple of questions. Luke, how do you balance driver privacy concerns with the need for detailed telematics data collection, and what strategies have worked best for gaining driver buy-in whilst maintaining safety oversight? Good question, Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Driver privacy is obviously always the first thing that comes up with telematics. I think it's important when telematics and all these technologies are introduced that there's clear guidelines on who can access the data, what's happening with the data, whether the drivers trust that the data is not going to be used for discipline, for example, to find out when the drivers are starting and finishing their work, or if they're sort of stopping at the gym on their way home, sort of that kind of detailed, disciplinary kind of data analysis. If the drivers find out that that's happening, or if anything like that happens and there's no trust, it usually doesn't work. And especially when there's unions involved, if you're working with big fleets, those kinds of policies just don't work. I've worked with two big fleets that were quite opposite in the way they implemented telematics. One of them was like, this is safety only. Nobody gets access to any data at all. It's for driver improvement. It's for driver coaching, and that really got the unions on the right side, got the drivers buy-in pretty quickly, and the drivers had trust because they also, once the drivers start seeing that it's not being used for anything else, I think that the buy-in comes pretty quickly. It was a long question. What was
it was a long question. Thanks for that, Luke.
And Simon,
go on, Jerome.
Just quickly on that as well, like we did a webinar with Southern Cross Protection, Claire Kay, and she's been there. And you imagine they're working high risk period, lone drivers, lots of pressure on them. And when she came in, they used telematics data, and you were looking at ROI. They went from a point where they demonstrated they didn't need a quarter of their fleet was always in the workshop because it was always banged up. And so when they engaged their drivers, the gamification, they did all this sort of component, they got them on board, really creative stuff. And it's a tough sector, but she really showed how all of a sudden they're having less bang ups, these sort of components, competitions between branches, all these sort of best drivers, all these things going through. It was never used for consequences as well. And all of a sudden they discovered their fleet didn't have to be quite as big because they had less vehicles in the workshop.
Yeah. And I think if you start with safety as well, Jerome, if you start with the right mindset and the right culture, I think all these benefits, there's another question by Luke there in terms of ROI, other than the safety ROI, you start seeing a lot of other benefits like utilization of vehicles, the way drivers drive, which has impact on fuel and sustainability. And I think, drivers once they start taking responsibility for their own safety and driving, you start seeing a lot of other benefits, reduced maintenance, obviously reduced crashes is a big.
Tanvi, you can essentially, I've seen some systems that they're like a fleet management system. You can work out what vehicles need to be moved from combustion to EVs. You can defleet. I mean, quickest way to reduce the risk and cost for a company is to work out which vehicles are being used. Then you can manage pool cars, etc. So, absolutely. I think there's a lot of ROI there, Luke. It's just trying to articulate it. And in a time when premiums are going up, they're not necessarily going down. It's maybe stabilizing at the moment. Cost of repairs are going up. Everyone's trying to work out how to save money. And that can be from a multitude of factors. But it's a good question, Luke. While I've got you, Tanvir, and I've got to be careful because I can't pronounce this word, and that's just my brain. But we talked about presenteeism. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
And I asked my team internally, it might be indicative of us rather than you, but none of us really understood it. And I did my own research. But I think given what we talk about with driver behavior and risk profiling, maybe you can elaborate a bit more about it, because I think it's something that we need to talk about. And this is changing that conversation for brokers away from the outcome, which is claims, back to the behavior, which is the leading indicator. So presenteeism, what does it mean, Tanvir?
Sure. In a nutshell, presenteeism is basically when you're present, when you're at work, but you're not really there. So I think, if we talk from a mental health perspective, we've probably all experienced presenteeism at some point where you go to work and you're just not really there because of various factors. Jerome gave an example where the guy had taken possession of his house. You could have other factors like having new children, which we have 6-month-old twins.
Sorry.
So there's all kinds of.
You have 6-month-old twins.
Yes.
Holy Toledo.
But I'm present. I can promise. I'm present
now,
in this webinar.
But I've had meetings where I was a bit concerned about your sleep deprivation, but
and that it's part of that. And if you add to that, if someone doesn't like their job or if they're in the wrong career, All these factors just add up to being present, but not really being present. And then that just has a huge impact on how you drive. I mean, you can only imagine all of us work in an office, but drivers who drive to a site, for example, to do work, they're not professional drivers, so they're driving just to get to a site to do work, but it's an essential part of their work, so they can't avoid it. And it's what data can tell you is where those risks are spiking, and they may not be big spikes like Jerome said. If we're doing that kind of analysis, we can get early warning signs, or even warning signs that have sort of existed over a longer period of time that may not be huge spikes, but it tells a lot about whether someone's going through something stress, whether they need a change in shifts, for example, shift patterns, or any other conversations. And
just drawing that as well, Tanner, like I think understanding your workforce, the manager's eyes on what sector you're working in, because I know one of Australia's largest transport companies, a colleague who used to be there, she said the number one high risk day for their workers on the road in line haul was Valentine's Day. Like on that one day, because a lot of them are away there, and they're just pondering on, wow, what am I missing out? And I would say, look, you think a lot of shift workers, FIFOs, DIDOs, the list goes on, people doing this sort of component, you're away and knowing what's going on. You think about the rush into the end of the year. That's one of the, statistically, I think it's around November to mid-December. That's one of the top periods for work-related injuries, because everyone's focused on trying to get everything done for the summer holiday period, pushing the envelopes, burning the candles. And this is when I think you need to be sort of proactive in engaging your workforce and taking a step back. Managers need to do that, their eyes on, and then seeing if the data, because like Dan was saying, things might be happening in people's lives and the vehicle will flow through that. And then it's not the job of the manager to fix that person, but what are the resources that can put around them to engage and help those workers out as well?
Awesome. So
I think good example I have from one of the fleets I was working with cameras is, we've talked about the aggressive driving data and what that tells you. Now we have fatigue technology that picks up closed eyes and micro sleeps and all these kinds of risk factors. We had identified a driver who had triggered a fatigue alert. And when we spoke to him, he said, and this was 5 a.m. in the morning. So when he had just started driving to work. So that's another thing, that fatigue, it may not happen in the evening after 10 hours of driving. It can happen first thing in the morning. And when we spoke to him, exactly. And it's all these factors that could be in addition to just not having enough rest. So this driver said that he had a really stressful family event on the weekend, and he didn't even realize when he shut his eyes. He had actually had enough sleep, but because he had such a huge weekend mentally, he had closed his eyes for a few seconds and didn't even realize, just thinking and pondering what happened on the weekend. And it's just those kinds of factors,
And just a couple of quick points is building that fatigue part, that Tam, because I think you opened a lot there. So we've been working on a program with AAA around fatigue management, because a lot of problem when the fatigue technology goes off, it's too late. It's the person's driving. Whereas getting people to understand through self-regulation, what are your early fatigue triggers? And so this will be a program released I think later this year that we developed. And anyone who sits there and goes, well, fatigue, it's not a big problem. But the other thing, just to let you know, that Monash has, that we're working on developing at the moment, is a roadside fatigue test. So you can have drug, alcohol, and fatigue testing. And if you can demonstrate you've been awake for 22 hours of a day, 22 hours non-stop, that's classified as dangerous driving, which is a criminal offence.
Wow. Right, housekeeping. Any Q&A coming through? We've had a few questions. We've got 15 minutes left, so feel free to start coming through on the Q&A. Tanvir, change management's sort of a big term we're talking about a lot in our business at the moment, but it sounds like a lot of this is changing the mindset of organizations and ourselves and brokers. So just, put you on the spot, or both of you, is there any sort of tips around how to initiate that change management conversation? Because it sounds like you need leadership, potentially investment in data. You need to make some significant changes to get these significant outcomes. So is there any learnings that you've had over the last few years around how to start that conversation? And I'm thinking broker toolkit here. How can a broker talk to a fleet when they're in the renewal discussions, and we can arm our brokers with those sort of fact-finding questions? So just around continuous improvement, any tips for the audience?
The big one I always go to is first step should be is what's the problem you're trying to solve? So you're putting in what's the reason behind it. And then when you identify that, it's finding what is the best suitable element for it. And you don't have to jump in. I'd say you're going to test it. You create a driver community around, you bring your workers in, they help you select, choose, you test it with them, you bring them through, develop the framework, all the supporting systems for it. Because no Aussies in particular don't like to be told. Like you need change management is people have to feel like that they have to have had a voice, they have to have a say, they've got to have ownership. They've got to test it and believe it and understand. Back to Tanwi's point ages ago at the start, the why. Why are you doing this? Why are we buying into it? What does this mean to me? What does this all look like? And I think those things, and then the monitoring, the evaluation, the continuously check it, and you've got to build a cycle that goes through with all these elements.
Yeah, I'll just expand on that point as well. Just engaging drivers early is very important, and making sure that drivers feel heard. So if you're getting their viewpoints, actually acting on them, and making them feel heard. That if there's a consultation done, and if there's some suggestions, really trying to implement some of those suggestions. So that the drivers feel that they're actually part of the whole process rather than being told what to do. So change management is massive.
It's daunting, but it sounds like every organization could benefit from a bit of training on it for sure.
And I would say don't leave it in the hands of finance. Maybe don't do it for that reason, because I have heard of one organization put it in the first thing everyone knew about when everything began going off, and finance put it in to help with. And it was not a very successful.
What are you saying about people in finance?
Nothing, Simon. Nothing.
Just on that, what's the biggest hurdle? So you've identified the problem, as you said, Jerome. Everyone's in a room wanting to talk about continuous improvement, change management. What do you see, or what have you seen from your huge experience as the biggest hurdle? What stops it happening?
I'd say resourcing it properly as well. Like you've got to make sure everyone's prepared. They know what's going to happen. They've got the roles for it. Because once again, you got to remember a lot of this technology, it's simply just a tool. And you've got to have all the other systems built around it. And that's where like Tam Wehrling's had a crucial role in these organizations in helping them go through that sort of journey and plug it in. It's got to be independent. It's got to be sitting off to the side. It's got to have and like you look at Origin, for example, they've pushed all that off into an entirely different group. That sits Chinese wall from the entire organization. So Graham looks after all that, and that gives them the confidence that the two organization and where all this technology sits off to the side. But that takes a lot of resourcing. Not every company can do that.
But I was going to say the biggest thing, is trust. Just building on that point. I think if there's something like that where it's not necessarily ring fence, but there's a sort of clear distinction, and all the drivers understand that it's not part of compliance, and the data is not being accessed by someone who looks after discipline or HR or anyone like that in the business. I think trust just goes such a long way.
Yeah.
And one of the other really things as well, like if you've got the video cameras and that sort of stuff going on as well, using them for coaching and the drivers seeing that, and it may be packages go off to them, they can see what's going on as well. Because quite often the human brain is very malleable, and say something happens, they may not believe what they think actually happened, because the brain, other people might influence it. And then they see the footage and go, whoa, that's not what I recall. But that's that positive part and getting them on board and using it, and using it in a positive way.
Mhm.
That's a really good point, Jerome, because I've heard from a lot of drivers that um, who say, "Oh, we've got all these systems and all this data being collected and all this footage, but it goes into a black hole and they don't know what's going on." And I think when you share footage with drivers, they're very proactive, and in Osmos again is a good example. Drivers come forward. They want to know what's happening. They want to know what they did wrong. And especially with cameras, I think if there's trust and that transparency with cameras, it's amazing what the drivers sort of want to do proactively.
It can also protect the butts. So it can say, everyone's saying this is what was happening, and you go, it's black and white. The truck, it may not have been there. That's the other part. Like our organization, that wasn't our vehicle. Our driver didn't do that because look at all the data and the figures. Like we show stuff because it's a big way of protecting the drivers as well.
Yeah. Tell me, a question for everyone maybe. How does a breach in telematics system potentially compromise not only personal data, but also physical safety, e.g. through hacked vehicle controls or false alerts? Big question there, Felix. Thank you. Yeah, not an easy one.
No, it's a good question. I'll answer the easy part first. I think the physical safety or the hacked vehicle controls or false alerts. I think that if there's data analysis in place, it would be pretty straightforward to identify anything like that if there's hacked controls or if there's false alerts coming through. And also when the drivers are engaged, I think we would hear about that quite quickly. And if there's continuous data analysis going on, you can have all kinds of triggers and alerts in place where there's spikes. And I'm not a data scientist, but again, in the data world, these kinds of redundancies are quite easily built in. And in terms of breaching privacy of drivers, I think there's a few steps that can be taken. Telematics, for example, does have features where you can black out private trips or black out, for example, where the trip starts and ends, so that we don't know what the house address of a driver is, and just, I guess, making sure, like with data, to have all kinds of security in place with data, so the highest level of security, especially where you're recording the driver names, because not all fleets, Essential Energy, Jerome's done a lot of work with them. They were the safety award winners in the past as well. They don't record which driver is driving the vehicle. It's just an asset for them, and that's how they manage their safety. So there's a few different ways you can do it.
Actually, better have a cyber policy in place as well.
Actually, and Tam, we're like the EE one's really good. So Michael Mills sits in our steering committee and shared the other day, like one of the incentives, because we run what's called the Utilities Forum, where we benchmark all the different companies with each other. And Michael made a really cool point, which kicked off during a road safety week, is they just tried to get every driver in the organisation to be better than the organisational average. So they said, so this is what the average score was for the organisation. So they just got every driver, just try a little bit, just try and be a little bit better than what the organisational average was. And then guess what happens over time? If everyone's trying to be better than what the average is, what happens to the average? It gets better.
Yeah.
Really smart. And that's how he got this real competitive thing of everyone trying to beat the score. I thought it was very, very simple and easy.
That's really cool. Yeah.
So good at. A lot of questions on data, which is interesting. What are legal obligations and accountabilities on organizational and individual level when data is received but nothing's done with it? It's a really good question. Yeah, thanks, Sam. So they don't do anything with the data. I suppose it's a can of worms, isn't it? If an incident happens and we've seen the data and there's all the red flags, we've gone on that journey, and then the organization hasn't done something, I suppose it becomes a different type of claim. But yeah, any thoughts, Jerome, on that great question?
I think that's the worst thing you can do. Is you've had, and there was a legal case, was it last year or the year before, where the directors of a company finished up being prosecuted, where they had the data that they had um, the fatigue technology in the vehicle, and they weren't acting on all the breaches and signs coming through. So the worst thing you can do is you can have that data pouring in, and then you don't act on it, and
Yeah.
then something goes. It's all fine until something goes pear-shaped, and then I can always say, like, if you sit there and go, we do all this sort of stuff, and the coroner's doing the investigation, this sort of stuff, and we've done all this stuff since the crash, and they're going to go, why didn't you do that beforehand?
Yeah.
Like, it's too late now. So if you put this in, that's where you need, I think it's all part of how you're bolting this into a system sort of approach.
Yeah.
And you need to, if the information's coming in, what's your thresholds, where you're sort of sitting. And I would argue if you sit there and go your threshold, I remember talking to one organization, they said we had this enormous number of harsh braking events. So I said, well, what did you do about it? Oh, we increased the threshold by 20%.
Yeah.
Then it shifted to other sort of problems as well. And that's not fixing the problem. That's not going back. You've still got the problem there. You've just buried it.
Yeah.
And if something goes wrong and next minute they rear end someone and there's a whole lot of people killed, you've got you have a systematic history of poor driving behavior.
Yeah.
And I think with data collection, it's not only when you know and don't do anything. Ignorance is not a defense in these cases as well. Chain of responsibility, WHS laws. I think as soon as the data is being collected, even if you don't analyze it, if you don't do anything with it, it's just being collected in the background and nothing is being done. That also makes the officers of the company liable.
Gentlemen, we are almost out of time, so I think we've answered all our questions. Well, it's been a great chat. Thank you for all your time, and Jerome and Tanvir. Appreciate you coming on as guests. We've covered so much around change management, culture, leadership, lots about data, which is interesting, the telematics side. Some quick wins for brokers, what different types of questions we can ask. We've actually got another webinar on the 2nd of July. We're going to cover off AI telematics and how that connects to performance and pricing. So that is our second session. But on behalf of Current Insurance and Fuse Fleet Underwriting, thanks for your time. Been a really busy time of year, and good luck with the rest of the financial year. Jerome, thank you so much for being here, and Tanvir, thank you so much for being here as well. So thanks for listening, and let's keep the conversation going about fleet safety.
Thank you for the opportunity.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, gents. Thank you.